So, good evening. It's time to get started. We're going to talk a little bit tonight about the spring garden planting, particularly some of the early crops. I think when the Master Gardeners were discussing a topic for this month, we had thought cool season. Well, not too late for cool season, but we're getting toward the end of that period. So I decided when I started reviewing the crops to include some things that are technically warm season, but we can start thinking about planning. I was going to say there's one little caveat to that. Well, that'll be my last slide when we get to it. So there's a lot of possibilities with cool season crops, and these are not listed in any particular order other than how I found them and thought of them. But broccoli is one of those crops that we can still plant as late as this week. And if you're on the plateau or on Walden's Ridge, probably into next week and still be fine. It's a crop where you want to plant, or you can put up to 80 plants in a 100-foot row. I don't think many people would actually put it in a long row like that. It's probably going to be planted in a block, and which is fine. But you're going to need to provide it with some space, about 24 to 36 inches in row spacing with about 15 inches between the plants. So the 15 inches between the plants to give the plant room, that 24 to 36 is give you room to get in and to work around. And with broccoli, you can be 60, 70 days, depending on the variety, until you can see your first harvest. That again would depend on the variety. So something to think about when you're picking up plants is to see how long the maturity length is, if it's stated on the label. This would be the time of the year that I would probably be buying the transplants and not actually trying to get starts. Probably in another couple of 3 months, probably around July, if you start things from seed for the fall season, you could probably start. Now, according to the university publication, UT's publication on gardening and cool season crop, from that 100-foot row and 80 plants, you can expect 50 to 100 pounds of broccoli, is what they said. I think most of us with fresh broccoli is just going to be a few plants for the fresh, or if you want to store it, you can clean it, make sure there's no bugs in the head, and freeze it. Would be the ways you could store it. So broccoli is something we can plan into the first week or so of April, along with cabbage. And if you'll notice, cabbage is exactly the same as broccoli as far as how you're going to space the plants, how many plants you need to put in a 100-foot row. Length of harvest might be a little longer with cabbage. It says 75 days. I think broccoli said 70, but we're still in that same window. Depending on the variety of cabbage, though, that cabbage head could be a lot bigger. So you're going to get more poundage for your cabbage. Again, 80 plants is a lot of cabbage. If you're putting up sauerkraut, that's probably, what you're going to need the plants. But if you want just fresh cabbage for the season, then, you can choose your plants accordingly. Again, with cabbage, like with broccoli, I would, at this time of the year and this late in the season, be buying my transplants. And cauliflower. It's the third one in this group that we can also plant as late as the first part of April. It's a 55 to 65 day harvest with about the same amount harvested from the 100-foot row as broccoli. You notice all the other spacing and plant numbers per row and so on is the same for broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower. Now, this late in the season, you can start seeing toward the harvest time, and particularly if you go a little later than the 65, 70-day harvest interval, we can start seeing more pest being a problem. So, keep an eye on the plants, particularly loopers and dipel, and there's a couple other good options that are actually labeled organic that would work. So keep an eye on broccoli and cauliflower starting this late in the season. Which the other issue that I've noticed with broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage is rabbits. So the best option there is a dog that will scare them or some means of exclusion. So keeping them out of the garden. And this is a sidetrack from what I was going to discuss, but if you've got a small area, you might consider, fencing. Might put a strand of chicken wire or hardware cloth at ground level where something, rabbits, squirrels could probably climb just about anything. But those smaller animals that get in your garden won't be able to get in. Then I put a string of electric fence at 16 inches and at about 36 inches, maybe some bright colored flagging on it. And that could deter deer. Won't necessarily stop them if they figure out they can go over it. But if they find out it's electric and actually get shocked by it, they're less likely to be a problem. Deer's a real problem, and we may need to talk and get some better suggestions than just a basic electric fence. Okay, back on topic real quick. Cauliflower, broccoli, and several other things actually are all the same plant. They are the same species of plant. And I think there's like 7 or 8 groups within the Brassica family. The first one I got listed there, the Brassica oleensis, is the wild varieties or the wild. There is some cultivated or varieties that are listed in there, but that group actually includes the wild varieties. We have the group that's the Brussels sprouts. So Brussels sprouts and cabbage are the same plant. The variety is just their cultivar is selected for sprouts instead of lots of leaves. The cabbage would be. Then you've got the actual cabbage group. Then you got the cauliflower and broccoli group. You're actually eating the flowers or the flower buds in the cauliflower and broccoli group. Well, they also have the collards in the Chinese broccoli or the Chinese kale group. It would fall in. There's 7. Well, this is North Carolina's list. They said there were 7 cultivars or varieties that were a part of this group. And then, of course, kale also falls into that category as well. Most of the brassicas are cool. All of the brassicas, I won't say most of them. All of these brassicas are cool season. So the 1st of April, the 5th to the 10th of April for the Plateau and Walden's Ridge would be the absolute latest I would consider planting them. Most of these crops will tolerate a cold spell. They would tolerate a little frost. So these can be planted very early in the season. And there's other groups. I didn't get them all. So it's pretty interesting to find, they're all the same plant. Carrots is another crop that we can start as late as the first part of April in Tennessee. It doesn't take a lot of seed for carrots. They're a small seed. They're kind of irregular in shape. So about 1/4 ounce of seed would actually cover a 100-foot row. So the seeds are pretty small. So you would basically plant this or sow it, maybe a better way to put it, with a 14 to 36 inch space between the rows, room for you to get between the rows. And then you may have to thin to about 2 to 3 inches between the plants, depending on how careful you were in actually dropping the seed and planting. It's going to take carrots about 75 to 85 days till you get to harvest. And that quarter ounce of seed, that 100-foot row, should have somewhere between 50 and 100 pounds of carrots. That's a lot of carrots, particularly for somebody like me who's not a big fan of carrots. However, again, that's a good guide for you to decide, hey, how big of an area do I need to plant in carrots? How many carrots do I need? Am I going to can soup later in the season and going to need carrots to be a part of that? So, you can kind of gauge how much you actually need for your carrots. Leaf lettuce. It's again into the first part of April. The thing with leaf lettuce that I noticed, I'll just go ahead and notice, days like today and several days like today, is it may have a tendency to want to bolt on you. Because when it starts getting really warm, it's going to try to go to seed. So if it starts to do that, then you're pretty much at the end of the season. You may be able to cut that seed head back and slow it down. But the lettuce gets a little tough and strong once it starts setting the seed head. Again, lettuce is a pretty small seed, 1/2 ounce of seed per 100 foot of row. And you need about 6 inches of spacing between the plants, with a row spacing very similar to what we've discussed so far. Lettuce, most folks would again lay this off in a small block, and this is perfect for a raised bed, and have an area where you basically sow, come back thin, and be able to have fresh leaf lettuce. Some varieties could be 40 days, as early as 40 days before the first harvest, up to 50 days for your harvest. I've never been quite 50 pounds out of the leaf lettuce, but if you've got a good site, you tend to keep it watered, you can have quite a bit of leaf lettuce. Again, leaf lettuce is not one of those crops that we tend to store and hang on, we eat fresh. So think about the amount of lettuce that you actually need for the for your use. Something else going into next season that you can keep in mind is that we can plan as early as February, and we typically by February in the last 4 or 5 years have had that really, really, really cold snap over with. So Valentine's Day, you can start seed some lettuce. I probably wouldn't put out all of my lettuce that early, but if you get lucky, keep it covered during the really cold spells, you can have lettuce, 40 days. So that's you'd have less by now. If you planted or be getting ready to have lettuce, you'd plant it on Valentine's Day. So this is one of those crops that if you can protect it from the really cold time period, then it can start early. And it can tolerate some light frost and some cold nights. English peas. It's a little late for the valley possibly, but it may not be, depending on what we get. But on the plateau, the last week or so was the best time or best window, according to the UT recommendations. It's going to take you about a pound, maybe 1/2 pound to a pound of seed per 100-foot row. Couple of 4 to 4 inches between the plants, and you can have peas in about 70 days at the most, and about 20 to 30 pounds of English peas. Again, this is one of those crops that if you want fresh, you may not plant quite a 100-foot row, But if it goes with your carrots in the soup, then you may want to adjust the amount you plant to accommodate what you need. And at any time, you all feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. So we can also have snap peas, which for the most part is exactly the same seeding rate, row spacing, plant spacing, and time to harvest as the English peas. So not a whole lot of difference. Again, as early as February 1, so on the plateau, you're probably looking mid-February through about the middle to end of March. I'll get it out right in a second. So again, if you're looking for just fresh, this might be one of those crops. Again, you might plant a little 2 or 3 weeks later. You can plant in a little more and stagger your harvest through that period from starting probably about the 25th of March through, that'll take you into May if you stagger some plantings. Particularly if what you're looking for is fresh and not looking to freeze or can your peas. Potatoes. Now, March is when the university recommends. I got a birthday in February, and if the potatoes weren't planted at my grandpa's before my birthday, we was wondering what was wrong with him. Typically, it was the weather wasn't right. It just was too wet or too cold to get out and actually work. Thing is, the potato's going to sit there till the soil temperature is just right. So planting early February, mid-February, in the valley, you could probably get ahead. You might not necessarily get ahead on the plateau. But starting the 1st of March, you can be looking at planting your potatoes and still in the next few days be able to get potatoes started. Again, like with any other crop, the earlier you plant it, the less chance you're going to have with insect problems. As the summer progresses and the insect pressure builds, then you're going to see more problems. But if you are looking at planting this now, just realize that as you get into the next couple 3 months, it will take you to mid-July, we're going to start seeing more potential for pest with this particular crop. Excuse me. Colorado potato beetle is going to be the one that I would be most worried about with the potatoes. And they are a pest that if you don't check your potatoes regularly, like every other day, it won't take them long to eat the potatoes. Flea beetles is another one that could be a problem with the potatoes. They'll eat little holes in the plant. But with both of them, a product called spinosad is labeled for Colorado potato beetle. It carries, depending on the brand, a organic label. And I say depending on the brand, what could make the difference between it being organic and not organic in its classification is the carrier, the inert ingredients that they add to the pesticide. So you want about 30 inches between your rows, spacing the potato about a foot apart. And when I was planting potatoes, that was literally a foot apart. Drop a potato, take a step, you drop a potato. Take a step, you drop a potato. It's going to take you about 100 days, give or take, till you actually see harvest. You want the vines to start dying down before the potatoes are, truly ready. However, that 90-day period right at the start of the harvest season, you can grub out some nice, what we call new potatoes. They're typically still small, thin-skinned. They don't store, but those first potatoes are awfully good. So a 100-foot row, starting with about 14 pounds of seed potatoes, is going to give you about 100 to 120 pounds of potatoes. You need to make sure, if you buy the seed potatoes, if there's a small seed potatoes, you can put the whole potato. But if you look, that's an old picture. I found it, it's actually an old WPA picture, I think. Anyway, if you look, they look like they've cut the potatoes. So cut the potatoes in half, quarter. My grandpa always said make sure there's at least one eye on the piece that you're cutting. So a bag of seed potatoes, 14-pound bag of seed potatoes cut can go a long way in planting. Of course, one of the tricks with potatoes is when you get it in, you can peel it. So once the potato gets 4 or 5 leaves on the plant, you can cover up those first set of leaves. You can just mound the soil up around the plant, covering that bottom group of leaves. And in a couple of weeks, you might be able to do that, what's now the bottom group of leaves. So you can have a mound. 8 to 12 inches high is probably the most you'd want to go doing that. And of course, the potatoes then would be in that hill. So the leaves will turn into roots or produce roots, and then those roots is what grows the tubers that we collect for the potatoes. So you can hill those potatoes in. I haven't mentioned this with any of these, but a good soil test and following the recommendations for a soil test, of course, help as well. Potatoes are probably not the heaviest feeder in the garden, but they are in the same family. They're solanaceous as tomatoes. So fertilizer can be a critical part of it. Sometimes phosphorus, potassium are not exactly right. Some of the micronutrients may not be exactly right. The potatoes probably won't do as well. Phosphorus, I think, is the one that their recommendations on the soil test often come back needing a little more than some of your other crops. So a good soil test and following that recommendation is something that's important. And water. These are, again, as I said, solanaceous, similar to tomatoes. So water can also be a critical thing. They don't like their feet wet. I found that out the hard way with experience, but they do take water to really do well. Radishes, still got a couple of weeks that you can plant some radish. This is a ½ ounce of seed can go a long way with your radishes. A couple of inches or so, but maybe not much more than a couple of inches between the plants. It takes you about a month before you see the harvest. Exactly how many radishes is in a bunch, it doesn't say, but I'm thinking it's the bunch I picked up at the grocery store a few days ago. Something about that, size of radishes. Again, radishes is one of those crops that we typically do not store or keep for a very long time and eat fresh. So think about, what your needs are in deciding how much you need to plant. So from about Valentine's Day to Tax Day is the window for radishes. So again, that's one of those crops that you could, particularly if you're working with raised beds, that you could stagger your plantings and have starting the middle of March through almost the 1st of June, having fresh radishes. So you might get those 50 bunches. You're just eating them over the course of 3 or 4 months. Radishes, carrots, potatoes, those are all root crops. Again, it's important to consider soil test with those. This is also the time to be thinking about beans. The next week or so in the valley, in the next couple of 3 weeks in the plateau and on the Walden's Ridge will be when you need to be planting your beans. About a ½ pound of seed will cover a 100-foot row. You're going to need some space between the rows, of course, for you to get in and keep the weeds and pick when it comes time to harvest. You're going to need about 4 inches between the plants. So I usually start with 3 inches or maybe a little less between the plants and then do a little thinning as the season goes on. And once the plants are up, it's going to take you about 60 days to harvest. And you can see anywhere from 80 to 120 pounds of beans that could be from that 100-foot row. Of course, that 120 is make sure you follow soil test recommendations. And most garden crops are going to need the equivalent of 1 inch of rain per week, particularly when we start seeing temperatures getting into the 80s. So we're 5.5, nearly 6 inches behind already, and we're already starting to see those 80-degree days. So water is going to be key to your garden. You can stagger your planting again with your beans. The bush beans, the bushier varieties work really well in raised beds. So if you are in the small area, limited in your space, there is varieties that are actually a little more compact than some, and the bush bean would be a good choice, as opposed to the pole bean. Same window, same seeding rate, same row and plant spacing. It's going to take about 60 to 65 days to harvest. You're going to get about the same amount, maybe a little more on the pole beans based on the UT's publications. To make sure that you stake these, some kind of trellis system. I call them pole beans because they take poles and make little teepee out of them. Have the vines come up over the middle of the rows from the rows on either side. A lot easier to pick than bush beans, or at least I think so. So if you are going to consider, April 10th, so the next couple of weeks here in the valley and about 3 weeks in the higher elevations would be a good time to be planting the beans. You can start harvesting these once the hulls start turning color, but you would want them good and dry if you're going to be storing them. So pay attention. You can harvest and eat a little earlier than they would be easily stored. Corn. We're getting close to that window for planting corn. Corn doesn't like to be really cold, so we still have another cold snap or two, particularly in the higher elevations. It might be a little early to be planting your corn. It takes about a quarter pound of seed per 100-foot row, but I would not recommend putting it in one 100-foot row. I would probably suggest 4 25-foot rows. Corn is in the grass family. It is wind pollinated. So a block instead of a long row would see better pollination than that one single row across your garden. So short rows in a block actually work much better. You're going to need some space between the plants, up to 12 inches. Depending on the variety, we're looking anywhere from 80 to 95 days to harvest. In that 100-foot row, you can get 120 plus ears from that row. If you're looking to put up corn, then plant it all at the same time. If you're looking to have corn to eat on and not too worried about putting up corn for the winter, you may want to plant, again, planting in blocks, but you might want to stagger about every 2 to 3 weeks between now and the 1st of June, so that you can stagger that harvest out and have fresh corn over a longer period. The old rule of thumb was about every 2 weeks you go out and plant another block or another part of the corn patch to stagger the harvest. But that rule of thumb may or may not work depending on the weather. If it stays warm and we get rain, then it might be a little quicker than every 2 weeks when the corn reaches a stage where if it turns dry for a few days, then what you plant 2 weeks later may catch up once it does start raining to the first you planted. So once the corn gets its second set of leaves, which would put it about knee high, which is typically about 2 weeks if all the conditions are right, then that's when you want to start thinking about planting that second to stagger the harvest out over time. So if you ain't got seed corn for your seed yet, now's the time to be thinking about it. If the weatherman's right, we may get some rain this weekend, which we could use. And then it's supposed to be a little on the cool side for a couple of days, and then hopefully when it starts warming up again, we can get the corn planted. April 15th, I think is when I planted last year, and we actually had lost some of it because it turned cold again. Or it might have been the year before. But anyway, sometime in the last 3 years, we planting on the 15th of April, we still lost corn to a cold snap. So don't get too hasty yet in planting things. There are some other varieties, the super sweets. When I said sweet corn, I was talking more the traditional sweet corn. Super sweet, such as peaches and cream, they like it a little warmer. So you'll be planting the 15th of April to the 1st of June. Again, the row spacing, seeding rate, and harvest intervals are the same as your older sweet corn varieties, and the number of ears you're going to harvest per 100-foot of row is going to be about the same. If you're going to grow more than a couple of varieties of corn, I would put some space between the blocks, because it is wind pollinated and varieties easily cross-pollinate. For the sweet corn varieties, that's probably not going to be a major issue, but field corn crossing with your sweet corn, the results are not what you would probably want. It's somewhere in between that sweet corn and field corn, leaning more toward the field corn. So you might want to put a little space between, or not a little space, some space between the different varieties if you want them to pollinate properly. Tomatoes. This is the one thing everybody is ready to put in the garden because they're ready to have that first ripe tomato. April 10th to June 10th is the window that is recommended for Tennessee. That April 10th is probably for Memphis. That June 10th is probably for Johnson City. So we fall somewhere in between. And to be quite honest with you, when people ask, 1st of May is usually when I recommend around here. Now, if you're in the valley, you might get by being a week earlier, at the end of April. If you're on the plateau, you're risking it till after Mother's Day to have your tomatoes in the ground survive, unless you're willing to cover them up and protect them from some of those last frosts. Because tomatoes will not tolerate a frost. You can put up to 50 plants per 100-foot of row, so they're going to be about 2 foot apart between the plants, with some 48 inches between the rows. Depending on the variety, you could have 70 to 80 days to harvest. There may be a few that might stretch it a little longer than that. In a well-tended tomato patch with a 100-foot row equivalent, those 50 plants could yield you a couple 100 pounds of tomatoes. So unless you plan to can a lot of soup and a lot of salsa, and some of you may want to do that, that's perfectly fine, think about how many plants do you really need. The other thing to think about with tomatoes is you think about what you want to plant is what do you want? Do you want tomatoes throughout the season with just to eat on? Then you may want an indeterminate variety. Indeterminate means that plant's going to continue to grow until something stops it. Bugs, heat, drought, or frost. Or you just get tired of it and you pull it up. But that indeterminate will just continue to produce fruit continuously. And as long as you keep the fruit picked, it will produce. So it'll carry throughout the summer producing tomatoes. The determinate variety grows, reaches that determined size, and sets fruit, and all the fruit comes in at one time. So over the course of a couple of 3 days, or maybe the week at the most, all of the fruit on that plant is going to be coming in and ripening, which is a great variety to think about with canning. So if you know, sometime, I don't know, first part of August, you've got a few days that you can can tomatoes and maybe make that work. You may not hit it exactly on the day you'd like to, but you can plant your tomato varieties to target that harvest interval and plant a determinate variety, have all the tomatoes come in at one time, and be able to can, freeze, make the rest of the soup. We've already got the carrots and a couple other things. Potatoes. We've already got potatoes planted to go in the soups. Beans. So, think about the how you're going to use the tomatoes and the number of tomato plants that you would want. Tomatoes are probably one of the heavier feeders in the garden. They are going to need nitrogen as well as phosphorus and potassium. So again, a soil test is recommended. The great thing about our soil test is they will tell you when to apply some of these fertilizers or fertilizing source, so that you can target the plant at the right stage when it needs that particular nutrient. Tomato hornworms are going to be the one major pest that you can look forward to in growing tomatoes. One's all you need, so keep an eye out. The other problem, well, technically there's a couple of 3 problems that people typically ask me about regarding tomatoes. The bottom end of the tomato is rotten. Okay. So that's not a disease. It's actually a nutrient deficiency. The other problem is my tomato split open. It cracked. So those two are actually related in most cases, and that is water. That inch of rain equivalent that most garden plants need is definitely needed by tomatoes. They could probably use a little more water than an inch equivalent of rain. Blossom end rot is the bottom end of the tomato rotting, and it is actually a calcium deficiency. 9 out of 10 times, it's not the lack of calcium in the soil, it's the lack of water for the plant to take up the calcium that it needs. When the tomato just simply splits in two, it's because it's been unevenly watered. It's been dry for a while, so the plant sits and doesn't grow a whole lot. The fruit doesn't mature. It's just waiting. Then we get a good thunder shower, an inch or so of rain, maybe in one of those showers. So now it's got all the water it needs and wants, so it takes up all that water real quickly, and it grows really quickly. And it actually grows faster than the skin, so it splits it. So even watering will lessen your cracking. Heat stress can cause some of that cracking as well, but again, keeping them watered will mitigate that problem. And keeping it well watered would lessen the chances of you having blossom end rot. If you end up having blossom end rot, even though you are watering, then we may need to, again, look at a soil test, see what the calcium it actually is in the soil. pH sometimes also has an effect on that as well. So liming, of course, lime's a source of calcium carbonate in most cases. And adjusting the pH right, keeping it watered, we can mitigate the most common problem I see with tomatoes, blossom end rot. Some other things to think about for spring. If you've not really finished cleaning up the garden, now's the time to actually do that. A lot of the weeds that we have showing up in this time of year and going forward throughout the summer can actually harbor some of those insect pests that we fight in our garden. So keeping the garden clean and starting now before it becomes too weedy is definitely something to think about. I've mentioned soil test already, so if you've not done any pre-plant fertilizer, particularly in those areas where you're going to do spring planting in the next couple of weeks or so, now's the time to be thinking about doing that. In fact, this next couple of days might be a really good time if we get the rain that they are saying we're going to get. I would be careful now, as dry as it is, with nitrogen on plants that you may already have in the garden, but phosphorus and potassium and would definitely need to be put down sooner rather than later. There is some plants that you can go ahead and direct seed, even though there's still a chance of frost, beans and corn being one of those. Soil temperature is the driving factor for beans and corn to sprout. So, untreated seeds and some of the super sweets are going to be very sensitive to soil temperature. So, as warm as it's been, I don't think that's going to be a major issue this year. But, we've frost-free date the last week of April. That's kind of actually a third week of April for the valley, is 28th, 29th of April for the plateau, the higher elevations. So, a week or so before that last possible frost-free date, we can still put corn and beans in the ground and hopefully be past any frost before they actually come through the ground. if you are transplanting warm season crops, tomatoes, peppers, squash, you need to make sure you are past that last possible frost date or be willing to go out and cover. There are going to be some years that the soil temperature has not reached that optimum level for root development. So those early transplant dates might not necessarily be an advantage, particularly, and that may really depend sometimes on the microenvironment, the area around where your garden is. So some may soil types and aspect, if it's northeast facing as opposed to southwest facing, may stay a little cooler longer than other areas. So getting in too big a hurry and the soil's still not warm is really not going to speed up the process, because the plant won't grow until the soil temperature is right. So I did put the frost-free dates, the 17th for Chattanooga, Dunlap, and this part of the valley. Probably another 7 days after that, we can still see frost. Crossville, we can see frost as late as May 10th. So it's going to be the 5th of May for us this far south, on Cagle, Fredonia, Signal Mountain, Lewis Chapel, in that area. So that rule of thumb that I tell everyone, if you live on the mountains around here, don't put your tomatoes out to Mother's Day. That's the reason why. Because we can still see frost into that first part of May. And then I found this, doing a little homework. This is from David Glenn, News Channel 9, on his weather blog from April 16th, 2018. On the 25th of April in 1910, Chattanooga had 4 inches of snow. In 1987, on April 3rd, Chattanooga had nearly 3 inches of snow. They did not let us out of school that day. We watched big snowflakes falling, and we did not get out of school early. It didn't last long. I have to admit it, it did not last long. But just think what it could do to tomatoes in your garden. You know, they had the same amount of snow in 1880 on the 8th of April, an inch in 1971. I don't remember that one. April 6, 1905, about 0.2 of an inch, and there were 3 other occasions they had 1/10 of an inch of snow in the month of April in the city of Chattanooga. You know, it was what? Well in the 80s today, and we're thinking, okay, spring's here. But if we go back and dig a little, we can see we could still have some winter. So my advice is to not get in too big a hurry on things. Now, like I said, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, some of those can tolerate some cold. And 4 inches of snow, you think that's going to be devastating, and 4 inches of snow is a lot of snow. But at least if it's snowing and things are buried in the snow, they're going to stay at 32 degrees. It might get colder outside, but you know, the snow is actually insulating. So you can still cover and protect some of those plants as well. And I think I'm going to stop sharing because I can see better without sharing. But now's the time to ask questions. You may have to unmute yourself.
So my first question, and I typed it out, but I'll go ahead and ask it.
Okay.
Which of the plants that we've talked about today can be started again for the fall garden? And so that was my first question. And can you use the same variety, or do you need to find a different variety?
Yes, you can, the same plants that we grow in the spring for cool season work really well in the fall. And typically the same varieties for most people picking the varieties. The 100-foot row, is this for a single person or a family? Again, I gave you some of the amounts that came from that 100-foot row under typical conditions. So a 100-foot row is going to feed a family and give that family some to put up. So, if it's a single individual, a couple, even a family that's not looking to can, freeze, or store for the winter, you don't need a 100-foot row of anything. So how much do you need? Well, that's really a tough question to answer, because that's really going to depend on you and what you would want. In my opinion, 200-foot rows of okra would not be enough. The more corn we can grow, the better off we're going to be, because we're going to put it up for the winter. The last of the corn from last year, it was a month ago when it finally come out of the freezer. So we need a little more corn to get us through. So you may have to, over a course of a couple of seasons, gauge what you can do. A 100-foot row of potatoes for Steve, and he just happened to be the one I saw there, may yield plenty of potatoes. I can't do that great with potatoes in our particular garden plot. That's just not something that does well on that site. So again, it may vary. Some crops just may not grow in your garden as well as you would like for them to. So you might need a little more to actually get you the amount you need.
I have a question.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is early blight a problem in tomatoes around here?
Blight, early and late, both can be a problem with tomatoes.
So how do we deal with it?
One of the best ways to deal with it is to look for varieties that have some resistance. So if you are studying the catalogs, they will give a list of the resistance for those varieties.
Yeah.
And that's one way to deal with it. You can do some preventative fungal sprays with Captan. And there's a copper sulfate, I think, maybe on that. I'd have to go back and refresh my memory of all the ones that's on that list for that. Also, late blight and early blight, both are soil-borne diseases. That spore for those diseases winters in the soil and will stay in the soil. So crop rotation. That's why we recommend not growing tomatoes in the same spot every year, to rotate them in different areas. And because it is soil-borne, you do not want soil on the leaf. So rain spattering, splash mud up on the side of the plant. And that just gives more plant surface area covered with soil for more spores to come in contact with the plant. So you can't really stop the rain from falling that way, but you can put some mulch under your tomatoes. It's one of the reasons why they grow it on plastic, to keep the weeds down and to keep the soil from splashing up on the plant. Mm-hmm. So wood chips, I've seen some folks try straw for mulch, but any organic mulch would work well for that. When you do water the plant, don't take the water hose and just spray it over the top of the plant. Actually water the base of the plant in the area around the plant itself, and try not to splash soil on the plant.
Thank you.
Well, I don't recommend overhead watering any of your garden plants. First of all, typically if we're having to water, that means it's been dry, and typically then very sunny and no clouds. So that water, particularly if you're doing it late morning and in early afternoon, that water is going to stay on the plant leaf and could sun scald the plant. Most of our fungal diseases and blights, moisture is a component of that cycle. So they have to be the right moisture conditions. So if we keep the plants wet, don't give them time to dry out thoroughly, and got to maybe have a dew. Sometimes when we're in drought, we don't have the dews like we would under normal conditions. But if we have a dew, it dries off late morning, and then you come in right after lunch and water your plant, and it stays wet for a couple more hours that afternoon. That's half a day or more that plant stayed wet, and giving the fungal diseases more of a chance to start. So the right variety, mulching, proper watering, proper fertility. Give that plant every chance it can to stay healthy and fight those diseases. And well, let's see, did I mention mulching again? If I did, fine. If I didn't, I'm going to mention it again. Does that answer your question? Me? All right, you got a thumbs up.
So that's why, as you're considering where to put what in your garden, you want to think about, summer will be here, and you want to think about how you're going to irrigate. So that's part of the whole planning thing. And any other information about where to put plants? Obviously, you can't put tomatoes in the same place twice. Any other plants we really need to make sure you're rotating them to different areas in the garden?
Okay, so bean plant or peas that was started and ready to transplant. Now, actually, if you started them and they're up, it ready to actually, as you said, to be transplanted, you're fine. I think you'll be fine. The thing is, starting them from seed now is going to be a little. I think it may still be doable, but it's going to be a little more difficult. But if the plants are actually up in transplants, that's fine. So a lot of those cool season crops that I mentioned, transplants at this stage is definitely going to be the best. But peas, I think transplant can be fine. Still fine. Now, it said what, peas, February, March, to start them from seed. My grandpa and his neighbor were in a race to be the first to harvest their English peas. Now, I don't recommend this, but it worked for him every year. He planted them in October. And they would overwinter and come up, and he'd have peas before anybody else would. It's not necessarily recommended, but I always thought it was funny that, well, anything about it. Peas are a cool season crop, so they're going to tolerate, even if they popped up, early, that's fine. But if you planted them late enough in October, they're just going to sit there and wait till the conditions are right for them to spread. And what would they have done naturally in the wild? Seed would have fallen, got covered up with something, leaves, and sat there in all winter until the conditions was right for it to sprout. So
did he do anything else? I mean, was there some secret thing, or just?
He just planted a row of them early enough to beat the neighbor.
It can become a competitive sport.
Oh, it was a competitive sport. The first tomato, the first peas, first corn. Yeah. So you have to drive by your neighbors to see how far along they actually are.
Got to do some recon. Okay.
Yeah.
I think somebody put up a question on the board or a comment about, and it just flashed and I didn't get a good chance to look at it.
It just said, those transplants, if they were shaded, would they have a better chance? If they're larger transplants, probably not. If they're still fairly small, I'm saying a couple of inches or so, and 3 inches or so in height, then maybe a little shading in the late evening when it turns really warm and hot, direct sun, and wouldn't hurt them. Peas, I think, will tolerate a little shade, particularly late day. But if they're up of any size, then I would put them in the ground and keep them watered. There's several publications, and you can go to the UT Hort. If you just Google UT HORT, you will find the UT horticulture page. It has everything from lawns and gardens that you need to know. And there is a section on growing vegetables in the garden with links to several of our publications. And if we don't have a publication on a given topic, then it's linked to another extension service, typically Georgia, North Carolina, and Kentucky, neighboring states with similar growing conditions. So you can find a lot more information about growing, some of these crops. And you will also find on that website a couple of years worth of the trial gardens results with some variety recommendations, which may come in handy as well.
And the reviews are very detailed. I mean, they tell
Yes,
not
they
just
are.
how they were to grow, but how they tasted compared to other varieties, how well they stored compared to other varieties. So they're very useful.
Yeah, it is. And they sometimes will do these trials with blind trials. So you may get a couple of varieties of a beans or squash or something and not actually know the variety. And you're asked to compare. Well, 9 out of 10 times, one of those is a common variety or one that's commonly grown in the area. That most folks will say, well, I always get, and they name this variety that their grandpa grew. It's in comparing it to one of the newer varieties that's out there. Just to show folks, there's some varieties that have come out recently that are comparable to some of the older varieties that are out there, and in some cases have better disease resistance than some of the older varieties. But what I was going to end with is you can go to the UT Hort page, see all the research results and all the scientific recommendations. But gardening for every individual can be one big experiment. Do I like this variety or not? Do I really like this particular crop or not? Do I need 2 tomato plants and lots of corn, or a little corn and lots of tomatoes? It depends on personal taste. But there's also a bit of an art to gardening as well. Just knowing when it's time to water, when you really need to look carefully for tomato hornworms or tobacco hornworms, we can have both. When to start watching for any, potato beetles or cabbage loopers, and just knowing when it's time to do something in the garden. And everybody's going to have a little different timing depending on their elevation and, you know, the conditions in their immediate area as to when things need to happen. So any other questions? One watching the chat. Nope, there's nothing else in the chat.
Well, I do want to bring up that we still have a few plots left at the community garden for $10 for the season. And if you're interested or you know someone who is, please pass that along to them. They just have to go by the extension office and they can sign up and pay their money, and we will get them set up with a plot. Also wanted to mention that the Master Gardeners will be at Valley Fest again this year. We will be selling plants and just be there to talk to people and answer questions. So please come on out first weekend of May and say hi.
One last question popped up in the chat.
Oh, cool.
The University of Tennessee does soil tests. For $15, we can do a basic soil test. It will cover the major nutrients. Nitrogen recommendations are made. They're not measured in the soil test because of the way nitrogen reacts in the soil. It's highly, highly mobile. So you pull a sample today and they can run the nitrogen test. It comes to rain and it changes. So nitrogen is not measured, but recommendations based on the crop are made. Phosphorus, potassium, calcium, there's like 14, I think, nutrients that are actually measured in our soil test. We have the kits and materials available at the extension office at 170 Church Street in Dunlap. And any extension office across the state actually has the materials to send the test off. It's going to take a couple of 3 days in the mail. Turnaround time at the lab is 24 hours this time of year. They're busy. This is their busy season, and the turnaround's pretty quick when it's the busy season because they have enough to keep the process going continually. And they will email you the results as soon as the process is done. It typically costs about, well, the last individual sample I sent was about $10.15, I think, what it cost me to mail it and send it to the lab. So it costs you almost as much to ship it as it will to actually get the soil test postage prices the way they are right now. But we can set you up very quickly with the materials you need to pull the samples. It takes, well, the box is about 3 inches tall and about 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 wide, and well, it's actually square looking down and tall. So it will hold just shy of a quart of soil. So if you're interested in soil tests, we can certainly stop by the office, and someone there, anyone that works in the office knows what to do. We are open 8 to 4:30 Monday through Friday, and usually closed around noon for lunch. If everybody's around the office, or more than 2 or 3 people are in the office on a given day, we may be open through lunch, stagger our lunch. But if the staff's out doing programs or meetings, and secretary, have a lunch break around noon. All right, any other questions? Well, you're more than welcome. If you've got any more questions, you can stop by the extension office or contact us, and I'll be more than happy to answer more specific questions. I had looked at the list of names of those that had joined. I think most of you know where to find me and have asked questions. But if you don't, as I said, 170 Church Street in Dunlap. So we're on the courthouse square, actually. We're just courthouse annex, and then us. So pretty easy to find. So if there's no more questions, we appreciate you all joining us this evening. I do have and Terry, you and I can double check with this, but I'm looking at a couple of dates in April, and we'll try to do that in person and possibly at the community garden site. And if it's raining, we can be at the fair building. So thank you all, and I have everyone's emails since you signed up, and I'll be more than happy to keep you all posted with the. I do have one question. I know Cindy and Terry are on my email list, but I send out regular monthly emails on garden and lawn, garden related, landscape related questions. So if you want to be on that, just let me know. I've got the emails from the registration, so just let me know and I can add you to that mail list. It comes out. I need to work on it because it's supposed to come out the first of each month. That's tomorrow. So sometime in the next week. Yeah, sometime in the next week. It went by fast. Yes, they can. Sometime in the next week, when that newsletter will come out. So I will add you to the list. And okay, can do that. Again, thank you all. And
thank you, Sheldon.
You're welcome. See y'all.